The gravitational shear outside the viewing port of the persistence of vision was not a visual phenomenon, but a physical ache that resonated in the marrow of Commander Kaelen Vance's bones. The ship was a jagged needle of matte black carbon lattice, designed not for beauty, but to survive the aggressive unspooling of local space-time that occurred near the event horizons of the Calignes cluster. For centuries, the multi-species cooperative known as the Harmonious Integration had avoided this sector, whispering of its instability and the way it devoured light and logic alike. The humans, however, had arrived in the galactic theater with a peculiar lack of ancestral fear and a distressing tendency to treat black holes like scenic overlooks. Vance adjusted the haptic interface on his forearm, feeling the subtle resistance of the ship's artificial intelligence as it fought to maintain the integrity of the forward kinetic shields. The bridge was a cramped cylinder of blinking displays and the low hum of atmospheric scrubbers, occupied by a crew that had been hand-picked for their high tolerance for isolation and their low regard for traditional safety protocols. To their left, the navigator, a woman named Siobhan Aris, whose lineage traced back to the high-pressure domes of Europa, was currently locked in a mental dance with the navigational computer, her eyes glazed with the blue sheen of a neural link. They were deep within the dead zone, a region where the laws of physics felt more like polite suggestions, and yet they were here because a distress signal had pulsed through the subspace foam, a signal that used an archaic, terrestrial frequency that hadn't been heard in over 300 years. The source of the signal was a massive, derelict structure that defied the architectural logic of any known civilization. It was a ring, miles in diameter, spinning with a rhythmic, pulsing light that seemed to draw energy directly from the gravitational tides of the nearby singularity. As the persistence of vision drifted closer, the scale of the object became overwhelming. It was not a station, but a cage, or perhaps a gateway, built with materials that absorbed sensor sweeps like a sponge. Vance felt a prickle of sweat move down his spine as he stared at the readout. There were no life signs, no heat signatures, and yet the signal persisted, a steady, rhythmic beating of binary code that translated to a single, repeating phrase. The door is unlocked for those who remember the hearth. The phrase was nonsense to the integration observers who had monitored their departure, but to Vance, it smelled of ancient earth, of old stories told by firelight before the stars were within reach. He signaled for the docking clamps to be primed, ignoring the protests of the structural integrity alarms. The ship groaned as it synchronized its rotation with the massive ring, the sound echoing through the hull like the moan of a dying leviathan. Aris blinked, the blue light fading from her eyes as she pulled back from the link, her expression one of profound exhaustion mixed with a sharp, predatory curiosity. She looked at Vance and nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that they were crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The air inside the docking umbilical was stale and smelled of ozone and ancient dust. Vance led the away team, 4 individuals clad in reinforced atmospheric suits that made them look like bulky, metallic golems. Behind him was Specialist Thorne, a combat engineer with a penchant for dismantling impossible locks, and 2 researchers, Marcus and Ilara, whose expertise lay in the recovery of lost human technologies. They stepped through the airlock of the ring structure and were immediately struck by the silence, not a true silence, but a lack of mechanical vibration that was unsettling in a space of this magnitude. The walls were made of a translucent, glass-like substance that revealed intricate webs of fiber optics and pulsing liquid gold deep within the material. There were no lights, yet the hallways were bathed in a soft, ambient glow that seemed to emanate from the very air. As they moved deeper into the facility, the architecture shifted from industrial to something almost organic, with vaulted ceilings that mimicked the ribcage of some titanic beast. Thorn ran a sensor over a nearby console and whistled through the comms link, his voice crackling with static. He noted that the power levels in this section were off the charts, but there was no discernible source. It was as if the station was breathing in the vacuum itself. They reached a central plaza where the floor was a mosaic of different Earth soils, preserved under some kind of stasis field: red clay from Georgia, dark loam from the Ukraine, white sands from the Gobi. It was a monument to a world they had largely moved past, a physical manifestation of homesickness on a cosmic scale. The deeper they went, the more the station seemed to respond to their presence. Doors slid open before they could reach for the controls, and the ambient light shifted from a pale white to a warm, welcoming amber. Vance felt a strange sense of recognition, a phantom memory of places he had never been. They entered a massive hemispherical chamber that appeared to be a command center, though there were no chairs or traditional interfaces. In the center of the room, a holographic projection flickered to life, displaying a star map of the Milky Way, but it was centered not on the galactic core, but on Sol. The map was covered in thousands of tiny, moving points of light, ships, colonies, outposts, most of which didn't exist in the current galactic records. Marcus gasped as he recognized the designations. These were the lost fleets, the generation ships, and experimental explorers sent out during the Great Expansion who were thought to have been swallowed by the void. They hadn't vanished. They had built this. They had created a sanctuary at the edge of the end of the world. The holographic image shifted, coalescing into the form of a man dressed in the simple, rugged attire of a 22nd century colonist. His image was grainy, a digital ghost reaching out across the centuries. He began to speak, his voice a gravelly baritone that filled the chamber without the need for speakers. He spoke of the Reciprocity Coefficient, a mathematical proof the founders had discovered, which suggested that the survival of a species was directly proportional to its ability to remember its origins, while simultaneously abandoning its limitations. The ghost explained that the station was not a weapon or a simple outpost, but a repository of humanity prime data, the unadulterated genetic and cultural blueprints of a species that had not yet been tempered by the cold pragmatism of the wider galaxy. The integration, in their pursuit of harmony and efficiency, had smoothed over the jagged edges of the human spirit, turning them into reliable, predictable cogs in a multi-species machine. The founders of this station had feared this homogenization and had sought to preserve the wild spark of Earth. Vance felt a surge of indignation and pride. He looked at his crew, seeing the same realization dawning on their faces. They weren't just explorers, they were the inheritors of a contingency plan. Suddenly, the station shuddered. A massive impact sent them sprawling across the mosaic floor. Thorn scrambled to his feet, checking his tactical HUD. He reported that 3 integration cruisers had just dropped out of warp and were firing on the station, their heavy graviton beams tearing at the rings out a shell. The integration didn't want this place discovered. They didn't want the wild, human variable reintroduced into their carefully balanced equation. The ghost in the center of the room looked at Vance, its digital eyes seeming to gain a sudden, sharp clarity. It told them that the station's defenses were dormant, waiting for a biological handshake from someone who carried the specific, unmutated markers of the Terran lineage. Vance realized with a heavy heart that the unlocked door required a key that was his own blood. The bombardment grew more intense, the very foundations of the chamber groaning under the stress of the graviton fire. Vance moved toward the central pedestal, where a simple, recessed plate waited for his hand. He knew that by activating this station, he was effectively declaring war on the very government he served, but the alternative was allowing the erasure of the history they had just rediscovered. He placed his hand on the plate. A sharp sting pricked his palm as the station's sensors sampled his DNA, comparing it against the ancient records stored in its crystalline heart. For a long moment, nothing happened, and the bridge of the persistence of vision reported that their own shields were failing under the onslaught of the integration ships. Then, the ground began to hum, a deep subsonic thrum that vibrated in Vance's teeth. The amber light in the room turned a blinding, defiant red. Outside, the ring's rotation accelerated, its surface glowing with an intensity that rivaled the nearby star. Massive apertures opened along the ring's circumference, revealing batteries of weapons that looked less like cannons and more like focused lightning. The first volley from the station didn't just damage the integration cruisers, it dismantled them at the molecular level, turning high-tech warships into clouds of shimmering metallic dust in a matter of seconds. The wild spark had been ignited, and as Vance looked at the star map, he saw the thousands of points of light begin to move, all of them turning back toward the center of the galaxy. The homecoming had begun, and it would not be a quiet affair. The destruction of the integration scouts was so absolute that it left a vacuum of information in the local comsnet, a silence that Vance knew would only last until the next battle group arrived. He pulled his hand from the pedestal, the wound on his palm already sealing under a layer of advanced medical gel provided by his suit. Ilara and Marcus were frantically downloading data from the station's core, their portable drives glowing as they struggled to contain the sheer volume of history, science, and philosophy being poured into them. Thorne was at the edge of the chamber, his rifle leveled at the door, though his posture suggested he was more in awe than in fear. Vance walked to the edge of the holographic map, watching as the dots, the lost fleets, accelerated to speeds that shouldn't be possible according to current slipstream theory. These ships weren't just returning, they were coming back with technology that had been allowed to evolve in isolation, free from the bureaucratic stagnation of the integration. He realized then that the station was more than a repository, it was a beacon, a rally point for every human soul that had ever felt the itch of the unknown. The Reciprocity Coefficient wasn't just a math problem, it was a promise. If humanity gave itself to the stars would eventually give humanity back to itself, transformed and unyielding. Vance looked at Aris, who was watching the monitors with a look of fierce, uncontained joy. They weren't just a small crew on a fringe mission anymore, they were the vanguard of a revolution. He gave the order to prepare for a hard burn back to the inner systems, knowing that by the time they arrived, the galaxy would already be beginning to burn with the light of 1,000 returning suns. The transition from the relative safety of the station back into the pressurized confines of the persistence of vision felt like being shoved into a coffin after experiencing the vastness of an open plain. Commander Kaelen Vance could still feel the phantom heat of the pedestal on his palm, a lingering warmth that seemed to pulse in sync with the ship's reactor. As the docking umbilical retracted, the structural sensors screamed a warning. The gravitational wake of the station's sudden activation was warping the local spacetime fabric into a chaotic mess of tidal forces. Siobhan Aris was already back in her chair, her hands flying across the tactile interface with a desperate fluidity. She didn't wait for a formal command to initiate the departure sequence. The ship's engines flared with an unconventional violet hue, a direct result of the power surge fed into their systems by the station's final data handshake. They weren't just running on their own fuel anymore. They were riding a wave of ancient, harvested energy that propelled them away from the Caligni's cluster at a fraction of a percent below the theoretical speed of light. Behind them, the massive ring structure began to phase out of the visible spectrum, its mission of preservation complete, leaving nothing but the shimmering dust of the destroyed integration cruisers to mark their passage. Vance watched the rear monitors until the golden glow of the station vanished into the obsidian blackness of the void, feeling a heavy sense of responsibility settling over his shoulders like a leaden cloak. He knew that the data Ilara and Marcus had retrieved was the most dangerous substance in the known universe, far more volatile than any antimatter warhead. It was the truth of what humanity had been before they were domesticated by the consensus of the galactic community. The journey back toward the edge of integration space was a tense, claustrophobic affair, as the crew worked in a feverish silence to process the initial layers of the recovered archives. Marcus had set up a localized network in the small galley, the only place with enough table space to spread out the physical drive arrays they had salvaged. He was currently staring at a volumetric projection of a human genome, one that looked vastly different from the standardized, optimized sequences mandated by the Integration Health Ministry. This version was messy, filled with redundancies, aggressive immune responses, and a chaotic neural architecture that suggested a high capacity for both extreme violence and profound empathy. It was the blueprint of a predator that had learned to build cathedrals. Ilara, meanwhile, was obsessed with the technical schematics of the Lost Fleet ships. She noted that their propulsion systems didn't rely on the standard graviton manipulation used by the rest of the galaxy. Instead, they appeared to use a form of vacuum energy extraction that the integration had long ago declared mathematically impossible. The implications were staggering. If these ships were returning, they wouldn't just be faster than the integration navy, they would be operating on an entirely different level of reality. They would be ghosts in the machine, capable of appearing and disappearing at will, bypassing the jump gates that controlled all commerce and military movement in the sector. Vance stood in the doorway of the galley, watching them work, his mind already 3 steps ahead, calculating the political fallout of their discovery. The first sign that their escape had not gone unnoticed came 3 days into the return transit. A high-priority encrypted burst hit their receiver, bypassing the standard communications array and appearing directly on Vance's private terminal. It was a summons from High Inquisitor Vrax of the Integration Oversight Committee, the very entity responsible for maintaining the harmony between the member species. Vrax was not a human. He belonged to the Cestari, a species of telepathic cephalopods who viewed human unpredictability as a biological defect to be managed. The message was cold and stripped of all diplomatic pleasantry, demanding that the persistence of vision divert immediately to a secure facility on the moon of Krios for quarantine and debriefing. Vance knew that quarantine was a euphemism for the permanent erasure of the crew and the confiscation of their findings. He looked at the message for a long time, the green text reflecting in his dark eyes, before he deleted it entirely. He didn't tell the crew about the summons, but he did order Thorn to begin the process of blacking out the ship's transponder and rerouting the sensor baffles to mimic the signature of a stray comet. They were no longer a research vessel on an official mission. They were fugitives carrying the embers of a dead fire. Thorn, sensing the shift in tone, didn't ask questions. He simply began stripping the exterior plating of unnecessary lights and polishing the heat sinks to minimize their thermal footprint. As they crossed the invisible border into the Krios system, the reality of the situation became even more dire. The long-range scanners picked up a massive buildup of integration forces at the primary jump gates, over 50 capital ships, including 3 dreadnought-class carriers. This wasn't a standard patrol, it was a blockade. The integration was terrified. They had detected the energy spike from the Calignes cluster and had correctly surmised that the human problem was about to become an existential threat to their hegemony. Vance gathered the crew in the bridge, the air thick with the smell of recycled oxygen and the sharp tang of nervous sweat. He told them the truth. They were being hunted, and the jump gates were closed to them. Their only hope was to use the experimental data Ilara had decoded to attempt a blind jump, using the station's energy signatures. It was a maneuver that had a 90% chance of tearing the ship apart, but the alternative was a slow death in an integration laboratory. Aris looked at the navigation console, then at Vance, her expression one of grim determination. She didn't hesitate. She began inputting the raw, unverified coordinates provided by the ancient archive. The ship began to vibrate, a high-pitched whine that escalated until it was a physical pain in their ears. The walls of the bridge seemed to stretch and thin, the stars outside the port turning into long, distorted streaks of violet light. They weren't just moving through space, they were slipping between the layers of it. The transition was violent. The persistence of vision was tossed like a leaf in a hurricane, the internal gravity failing and returning in nauseating bursts. Vance was thrown against his restraints, his vision blurring as the G-forces climbed to lethal levels. He saw Thorn shouting something, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the atmospheric scrubbers working at triple capacity. Then, with a final bone-jarring jolt, the motion stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the frantic beeping of the life support monitors. They were no longer in the cryo system. They were in a region of space that didn't appear on any modern chart, a dense nebula of shimmering gas and crystalline asteroids that acted as a natural sensor shield. In the center of this nebula sat a fleet. It wasn't an integration fleet. The ships were brutal, angular things, built with the same matte black carbon lattice as the persistence of vision, but on a scale that made Vance's ship look like a toy. These were the lost fleets, the vanguard of the returning. Thousands of ships, silent and watchful, waited in the heart of the nebula like a sleeping army. As the persistence of vision drifted among them, a single communication channel opened, filling the bridge with a sound that brought tears to Vance's eyes. It wasn't a message in code or a demand for surrender. It was a recording of a thunderstorm on Earth, the sound of rain hitting dry Earth, a sensory memory from a world none of them had ever seen, but all of them belonged to. A massive ship, easily the size of a small city, detached itself from the formation and began a slow approach. Its hull was etched with the names of every major city that had existed on Earth before the Great Expansion: London, Tokyo, Nairobi, New York, Rio de Janeiro. It was a flying history book, a testament to the endurance of a species that refused to be forgotten. A docking bay opened, a cavernous maw of white light that beckoned them inward. Vance felt a strange sense of peace. He realized that the Reciprocity Coefficient wasn't just about survival, it was about the inevitable return to the source. The integration had tried to turn them into something they weren't, to prune the wild branches of the human tree until it fit into their garden. But they had forgotten that trees have roots, and those roots go deep into the dark earth. As the persistence of vision settled into the docking cradle, the crew stood up, unbuckling their restraints with shaking hands. They were no longer alone. They had found the hearth, and it was burning brighter than they had ever dared to imagine. Vance looked at his team, seeing the reflected fire in their eyes. They were the ones who had unlocked the door, and now they were going to see what was waiting on the other side. The galaxy was about to learn that you can only push a human so far before they find their way back home, and they never come back empty-handed. The interior of the massive vessel, which they soon learned was named the Aegis of Remembrance, was a stark contrast to the sterile, utilitarian aesthetic of the integration. It was filled with greenery, actual trees, flowing water, and the scent of blooming jasmine. The people who met them at the airlock were not the haggard, desperate refugees Vance had expected. They were tall, healthy, and possessed an intensity of gaze that was almost unsettling. They wore simple, functional clothing, but their movements were precise, athletic, and full of a confidence that had been bred out of the inner system humans over generations. The leader of the group, a man whose skin was the color of deep mahogany and whose eyes were the clear blue of an Antarctic glacier, stepped forward and gripped Vance's forearm in a traditional warrior's greeting. He introduced himself as Commander Jackson, a descendant of the original crew of the Aegis. He didn't ask for their mission or their credentials. He simply said, "Welcome home, cousins. We've been watching the gates for a long time." Vance felt a lump in his throat as he looked around the bay. He saw children playing among the hydroponic stacks and old men sharpening blades that looked both ancient and technologically advanced. This was a society built on the principle of the frontier, perpetual readiness, perpetual curiosity. They hadn't just survived in the dark, they had thrived, creating a culture that was a synthesis of everything humanity had once been and everything it could become. Jackson led them to a high-ceilinged hall that overlooked the nebula. From this vantage point, the sheer scale of the fleet was even more apparent. There were tens of thousands of vessels, ranging from small scouts to massive factory ships that could strip an asteroid of its resources in hours. Jackson explained that they had been waiting for the Caligni's signal, the activation of the station Vance had just visited. It was the signal that the integration had finally overstepped, that the domestication of the inner systems had reached a breaking point, and that the wild humans were needed once again to restore the balance. The Reciprocity Coefficient was more than a math proof, it was a military strategy. It dictated that for every action taken by the integration to suppress human nature, there would be an equal and opposite reaction from the fringes. The integration had spent centuries trying to minimize the human variable, and in doing so, they had ensured that the eventual response would be catastrophic. Vance realized with a start that he wasn't just a guest, he was a catalyst. His arrival and the data he brought with him was the final piece of the puzzle. The archives contained the encryption keys for the integration's entire defense network, keys that had been surreptitiously embedded into the very foundation of the galactic core by human architects centuries ago, a long con played by the original founders who knew this day would come. The atmosphere in the hall shifted as a massive holographic display flickered to life, showing the current state of the galaxy. The integration space was a sprawling web of blue, but it was being encroached upon by a creeping red tide, not an invading army, but a systemic collapse. The integration's reliance on harmony had made them brittle. Their economies were stagnating, their military was bloated and slow, and their various species were beginning to bicker over dwindling resources. They were a house of cards waiting for a breeze. Jackson pointed to the center of the web, the capital world of Prime. "We aren't going there to conquer," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "We are going there to offer them a choice. They can allow the human spirit to flourish, or they can watch as their entire civilization unravels from the inside out. We are the cure for the sickness of stagnation." Vance looked at the red tide and then back at Jackson. He knew that the integration would never choose to change. They would fight to maintain their control until the very end. The choice Jackson was offering was an ultimatum backed by the largest fleet the galaxy had ever seen. He thought of the billions of people living in the inner systems, people who had been taught to fear their own shadows, and he felt a cold, hard resolve take root in his heart. It was time to show them what it meant to be human. It was time to bring the thunder. The strategic theater, aboard the Aegis of Remembrance, was a cathedral of light and data, where the air hummed with the collective processing power of 1,000 synchronized ship minds. Commander Kaelen Vance stood beside Jackson, watching as the tactical maps shifted from static blue to a pulsing, agitated violet. The data his crew had brought back was being integrated into the fleet's targeting computers, revealing the hidden flaws in the integration's supposedly invincible defense perimeter. It was a revelation of architectural hubris. The Cestari and their allies had built their jump gates and orbital platforms on a foundation of rigid logic, never accounting for the possibility of a force that could navigate the chaotic undercurrents of the subspace foam. Marcus and Ilara were already deep within the technical bays, working alongside the fleet's engineers to adapt the persistence of vision with the vacuum energy cores that powered the vanguard ships. The atmosphere was one of intense, focused preparation, a stark contrast to the panicked bureaucracy Vance had left behind. There were no debates, no committee meetings, and no calls for consensus. There was only the objective. Jackson leaned over the console, his fingers tracing the glowing lines of the primary trade routes that linked the core worlds. He explained that the integration's strength was also its greatest vulnerability. Their total reliance on the centralized jump gate network meant that by severing just 3 key nodes, the Vanguard could isolate the capital system from its military reinforcements in a matter of hours. The plan was a surgical strike of unprecedented scale. The Vanguard would not engage the integration's heavy carriers in a traditional war of attrition. Instead, they would use their superior mobility to bypass the front lines entirely. Vance felt a flicker of the old military conditioning, the voice of the Integration Academy warning against the dangers of overextension, but he suppressed it. He was looking at a map drawn by people who had spent 3 centuries mastering the art of the impossible. Jackson turned to him, his expression unreadable in the harsh light of the holographic display. He asked Vance if he was prepared to lead the spearhead into the Aurelius sector, the gateway to the core. It was a calculated risk. Vance's ship carried the original signatures of an integration vessel, which, combined with the new Vanguard masking technology, would allow them to get close enough to the primary gate to deploy the viral encryption keys. If they succeeded, the gate would lock in an open state, creating a permanent bridge for the Vanguard fleet. If they failed, they would be crushed by the orbital batteries before they could even send a distress signal. Vance looked at the map, then at the scarred, resilient face of the man who had offered him a home. He didn't think of the danger. He thought of the mosaic of Earth soils on the station and the way the ghost of the founder had looked at him. He accepted the command without hesitation, feeling the weight of the galaxy's future shifting onto his shoulders. The persistence of vision had been transformed. Its matte black hull was now etched with the shimmering, iridescent veins of vacuum conduits, and its interior bridge had been expanded to accommodate the high-density neural links of the Vanguard. Siobhan Aris sat at the helm, her eyes no longer just glowing blue, but burning with a deep, internal fire that suggested she was becoming one with the ship's new heart. Thorne was in the weapons bay, recalibrating the kinetic projectors to fire the reciprocity rounds, projectiles that utilized gravitational shearing to bypass energy shields. They were no longer a crew of 4, they were a unit of the Vanguard, a tiny but lethal edge on a very long blade. As they undocked from the Aegis, the massive carrier let out a low-frequency pulse, a vibrational salute that echoed through the nebula. Vance felt the ship jump, but it wasn't the violent, gut-wrenching heave of the integration warp drives. It was a smooth, silent slide into the void, like a needle passing through silk. They were traveling through the blind spots of reality, moving at speeds that rendered the integration's long-range sensors useless. Within minutes, the shimmering gas of the nebula had been replaced by the cold, crowded reality of the Aurelius sector. The primary jump gate loomed ahead of them, a massive ring of gold and steel that spanned 50 miles, surrounded by a swarm of patrol ships and automated defense platforms. The deception worked with terrifying efficiency. The integration scanners identified the persistence of vision as a damaged scout returning from a deep-range mission, and the automated traffic control cleared them for an emergency approach to the gate's maintenance spire. Vance watched the monitors as they drifted past the massive hull of an integration battleship, its crew likely unaware that a wolf was moving through their flock. The tension on the bridge was a physical weight, a pressure in the ears that made every breath feel labored. Aris kept the ship on a steady, sluggish trajectory, mimicking the erratic movements of a vessel with a failing reactor. They reached the shadow of the maintenance spire, a jagged outcropping of machinery that served as the gate's neural hub. Thorn signaled that the viral payload was ready. With a single, sharp command from Vance, the persistence of vision shed its disguise. The vacuum energy cores flared to life, and the ship's kinetic projectors opened fire, not at the patrol ships, but at the gate's primary cooling arrays. The impact was instantaneous. The gold and steel ring shuddered as the thermal runaway began, and simultaneously, the viral keys were injected into the gate's control network. The integration ships scrambled to react, their comms channels erupting in a chaotic storm of orders and counterorders, but it was too late. The gate didn't explode, it transformed. The blue energy field that normally occupied the center of the ring turned a violent, screaming red. The space within the ring began to fold in on itself, creating a stable wormhole that reached all the way back to the Vanguard Nebula. On the other side, the Aegis of Remembrance and its 10,000 sister ships were already moving. The first of the Vanguard cruisers erupted from the gate with the force of a supernova, their weapons already locked onto the integration battle group. The battle that followed was not a contest of strength, but a demonstration of evolutionary divergence. The integration ships fired their heavy graviton beams, but the Vanguard vessels simply flickered out of phase, the beams passing through them as if they were ghosts. When the Vanguard returned fire, they used the very gravitational tides of the sector against their enemies, crushing the integration hulls like soda cans. Vance watched the carnage from the persistence of vision, feeling a cold, detached sense of justice. He saw the Sestari flagship, a beautiful, translucent vessel of light, get torn apart by a single, focused burst of vacuum energy. The harmony of the integration was being dismantled, one ship at a time, replaced by the raw, unbridled power of a species that had refused to stay in its cage. Amidst the chaos, a single message broke through the Vanguard's jamming field. It was from High Inquisitor Vrax, his telepathic voice projected through the comms link with such force that it caused Vance's nose to bleed. Vrax wasn't begging for mercy, he was screaming in confusion. He couldn't understand how a primitive lineage had bypassed the laws of physics that the integration had spent millennia perfecting. He called them monsters, aberrations, a cancer upon the orderly body of the galaxy. Vance wiped the blood from his lip and opened a channel back to the Sestari. He didn't use a speech or a manifesto. He simply sent back the data from the Earth mosaic, the images of the red clay, the dark loam, and the white sands. He told Vrax that the integration hadn't been maintaining harmony, they had been maintaining a graveyard. The Vanguard wasn't an invasion, it was an exhumation. As he spoke, the Aegis of Remembrance cleared the gate, its massive bulk dwarfing everything else in the sector. The battle for the Aurelius sector was over in less than 20 minutes. The remaining integration ships, seeing the scale of the force they were facing, began to flee toward the core, their formation broken and their morale shattered. The Vanguard did not pursue the fleeing ships immediately. Instead, they began the process of securing the gate and establishing a bridgehead. Vance was summoned to the Aegis for a briefing, but as he walked through the greenery of the carrier's interior, he felt a strange sense of melancholy. He had won the battle, but he knew the war would be much harder. The integration was not just a military force, it was a philosophy, a way of life that had been ingrained into thousands of worlds. Toppling the government was the easy part, changing the minds of trillions of people was the real challenge. He found Jackson in the strategic theater, looking out at the shimmering debris of the integration fleet. Jackson didn't look triumphant, he looked weary. He told Vance that the other two gates had also been secured, but the cost had been high. The integration had attempted to scuttle their own stations to prevent them from being used, killing millions of their own personnel in the process. The Harmony was willing to commit mass suicide rather than face a world it couldn't control. This was the dark side of the Reciprocity Coefficient. the more humanity pushed for freedom, the more the integration would push for destruction. Vance stood in silence for a moment, the scent of the jasmine trees in the hall mixing with the faint, metallic tang of the ship's scrubbers. He realized that they were no longer just the lost fleets or the vanguard. They were the architects of a new era, one that would be defined by the very jagged edges the integration had tried to smooth away. He thought of the billions of people on the core worlds, many of them human, who had lived their lives in a state of tranquilized mediocrity. Soon, they would be woken up, and the transition would be painful. Jackson turned to him and asked what their next move should be. The Vanguard was ready to burn a path straight to Prime, but Vance knew that such a move would only reinforce the image of humans as monsters. He suggested a different path. They wouldn't attack Prime yet. Instead, they would use the captured gates to broadcast the archives, the true history of Earth and the biological reality of the human spirit, to every corner of the galaxy. They would win the war for the mind before they fired a single shot at the capital. Jackson considered this for a long time before nodding slowly. It was a gamble, a bet on the idea that the truth was more powerful than a graviton beam. As the first of the data bursts began to pulse through the gates, Vance felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt since he first stepped onto the persistence of vision. They were giving the galaxy its memory back, and nothing would ever be the same again. The broadcast did not arrive as a whisper. It arrived as a structural failure in the collective reality of the integration. Across 10,000 worlds, from the crystalline spires of the Cestari homeworld to the methane-shrouded refineries of the Outer Rims, every screen, neural link, and public terminal began to bleed the history of a forbidden world. Commander Kaelen Vance stood on the observation deck of the Aegis of Remembrance, watching the data stream telemetry as it saturated the galactic network. It was not merely text or video. The Vanguard engineers had utilized the station's ancient compression techniques to transmit sensory-emotive packets. For the first time in millennia, trillions of beings felt the phantom sensation of a salt-heavy ocean breeze, the terrifying majesty of a tectonic shift, and the fierce, irrational heat of human love and rage. The integration's censorship filters, designed to scrub primitive, emotional outbursts, were utterly bypassed by the archaic architecture of the code. Vance could see the impact in the real-time social metrics, a sudden, jagged spike in cognitive dissonance across the core systems. The harmony was built on the premise that peace required the suppression of the individual, but the Vanguard was showing the galaxy that a peace without the self was merely a well-ordered grave. The reaction from the integration high command was as swift as it was desperate. High Inquisitor Vrax, surviving the rout at Aurelius, had retreated to the fortress moon of Varles, where he commanded the remnants of the Central Guard. Rather than engaging the Vanguard in open space, the integration began to implement a policy of information sterilization. They didn't just try to block the signal. They began to shut down the planetary networks entirely, plunging entire civilizations into darkness and silence to prevent the contagion of human memory from spreading. On the world of Olaris, a major human population hub, the integration planetary governor ordered the execution of the local data ministers for failing to contain the leak. This was the turning point Vance had hoped for, yet feared. The brutality of the integration was no longer a hidden mechanism. It was on full display, a panicked beast lashing out at its own shadow. Reports of civil unrest began to flood the Vanguard's intelligence feeds. On Olaris, the human laborers, sparked by the visions of a world where they were not merely biological tools, had walked off the assembly lines and were facing down the robotic pacification units with nothing but their bare hands and a newfound sense of self. Jackson joined Vance at the observation window, his face illuminated by the flickering data streams. He noted that the Reciprocity Coefficient was entering its final, most volatile phase, the moment where the oppressed realized that their chains were maintained only by their own consent. Jackson's fleet was currently positioned at the edge of the Olaris system, poised to intervene. He asked Vance if they should descend to support the uprising. Vance hesitated, his mind weighing the cost of life against the necessity of a self-earned freedom. If the vanguard moved in, it would be seen as a foreign conquest, a replacement of one master for another. But if they stayed back, the human population of Olaris would be liquidated by the integration's cold efficiency. He looked at the telemetry from the planet's surface, a flickering map of heat signatures and kinetic impacts. The people were dying, but they were dying as individuals, shouting names that hadn't been spoken in centuries. Vance turned to Jackson and told him that they wouldn't send the fleet, they would send the persistence of vision. They needed to show the people that the wild humans weren't an invading army of ghosts, but people just like them, who had simply refused to forget how to fight. The descent into the atmosphere of Olaris was a harrowing journey through a gauntlet of anti-orbital fire. Siobhan Aris pushed the ship's new vacuum energy core to its absolute limit, the persistence of vision trailing a wake of ionized violet light that looked like a scar across the sky. They weren't aiming for the capital, they were aiming for the Great Plaza, where the largest gathering of protesters was currently being hemmed in by integration enforcers. Thorne was in the drop bay, checking the seals on a crate of legacy kits, devices that contained localized signal boosters and basic kinetic weaponry. As the ship breached the cloud layer, the scale of the conflict became apparent. The city was a grid of fire and steel, the elegant Sestari architecture being reclaimed by the raw chaos of a revolution. Vance felt a surge of adrenaline as he gripped the manual overrides for the landing thrusters. They weren't just a ship anymore, they were a symbol. The persistence of vision slammed into the plaza floor, its landing legs crushing a row of automated sentries. The airlock hissed open, and Vance stepped out into the thick, acrid smoke of a world on fire. The crowd was a sea of terrified, defiant faces, humans, but also many other species who had been moved by the broadcast. They looked at Vance as if he were a god descending from the heavens, but he quickly dispelled that notion. He didn't give a speech about destiny or galactic liberation. He simply opened the crates and began handing out the kinetic rifles, his voice a calm, steady anchor in the storm. He told them that the vanguard couldn't win their world for them. They could only give them the tools to win it for themselves. The integration enforcers, sleek bipedal machines with cold blue optical sensors, began to advance, their graviton disruptors humming with lethal intent. Vance raised his own rifle, a heavy, brutal thing of vanguard design, and fired. The recoil was a familiar, grounding shock to his shoulder. The machine he hit didn't just stop. It imploded as the reciprocity round warped the space inside its chassis. Seeing the invincible machines fall, the crowd let out a roar that was less a sound and more a physical force. The riot turned into a coordinated assault, a surge of biological will against mechanical logic. In the midst of the battle, Ilara and Marcus were working at the base of the city's primary transmission spire. Their goal was to hijack the local network and turn it into a permanent relay for the Vanguard's archives, ensuring that even if the integration shut down the orbital links, the message would remain. They were being protected by a group of local miners, men and women with soot-stained skin and hard, calloused hands. These people didn't know the math of the Reciprocity Coefficient, but they understood its soul. They fought with a desperation that the integration machines couldn't calculate. Marcus, his hands shaking as he bypassed the Sestari encryption, looked up at Vance and shouted that the spire was almost theirs. But as he spoke, a high-altitude integration bomber began its run. The Sestari were willing to level the entire plaza, killing thousands of their own citizens just to stop the transmission. Vance looked up, realizing they had no anti-air defenses in the plaza. The persistence of vision was a scout, not an interceptor. He felt a moment of cold, sharp clarity. This was the moment where the theory met the reality of sacrifice. Just as the bomber opened its bay, the sky above Olaris seemed to ripple. A massive, jagged shape tore through the atmosphere, not a ship, but a shard of the Aegis of Remembrance. Jackson had ignored Vance's suggestion of restraint. The massive carrier had entered the upper atmosphere, its sheer mass creating a sonic boom that shattered windows for miles. The Aegis didn't fire its weapons. It simply positioned its forward shields between the bomber and the plaza. The resulting explosion of the bomber's payload against the Aegis's shields was a harmless flicker of light. The carrier loomed over the city like a protective deity, its presence alone ending the conflict. The integration in forces, their central command link severed by the proximity of the Vanguard's jamming field, simply ceased to function, their lights fading into a dull grey. The plaza went silent, the only sound the crackling of fires and the labored breathing of the survivors. Vance looked up at the Aegis, then back at the people. They weren't cheering yet. They were looking at their hands, at the weapons they held, and at the machines they had broken. They were realizing that the world they knew was gone, and the one that was coming would be built by their own sweat and blood. Vance returned to the persistence of vision, his suit covered in the dust of Olaris. He contacted Jackson, his voice tight with a mix of anger and relief. He asked why the commander had risked the fleet's flagship for a single plaza. Jackson's response was simple and devoid of ego. The coefficient states that for every act of human defiance, there must be a corresponding act of human loyalty. You showed them how to fight, Vance. I had to show them that they aren't fighting alone. The revolution on Olaris was the spark that became a wildfire. Within 48 hours, a dozen other systems had declared their independence from the integration, their local human populations leading the charge. The Sestari were retreating toward the core, their harmony unraveling at every seam. But Vance knew that the final battle would not be in a plaza or on a moon. It would be at Prime, the heart of the integration, where the Sestari had spent 3,000 years perfecting a weapon that they had hoped they would never have to use, a weapon designed specifically to extinguish the wild spark once and for all. He looked at the data Marcus had finally managed to extract from the spire, the location of the Omega node. The end was in sight, and it was a cold, dark place. The approach to the Prime system was not the triumphant procession Kaelen Vance had envisioned in his more idealistic moments. Instead, it was a journey through a graveyard of shattered geometry and cooling plasma. The integration had not merely retreated. They had scorched the very vacuum behind them, detonating jump gates and orbital refineries to create a chaotic field of debris that hindered the Vanguard's pursuit. The persistence of vision sat at the tip of a massive wedge of 5,000 human vessels, its sensors struggling to filter out the ghost signatures of destroyed civilian transports. High Inquisitor Vrax had retreated to the Omega node, a crystalline superstructure tethered to the singular sun of the capital system. According to the data Marcus had bled from the Olaris spire, the node was more than a command center. It was a psychotropic resonator. The Sestari had spent millennia refining a technology that could broadcast a calm field, a low-frequency neural dampener designed to suppress the adrenal and emotional spikes of any biological entity within its reach. It was the ultimate tool of the integration, the mechanism that ensured harmony by effectively lobotomizing the capacity for dissent. At full power, it wouldn't just stop a revolution, it would turn the human fleet into a collection of drifting, mindless husks, their spirits extinguished while their hearts continued to beat. Vance stood on his bridge, feeling the first tendrils of the calm brushing against the edges of his consciousness. It was a seductive, terrifying sensation, a gradual numbing of his anger, a softening of his resolve into a lethargic, pleasant indifference. Beside him, Siobhan Aris was fighting it with a visible, physical effort, her jaw clenched so tightly her gums were bleeding. The vacuum energy core of the ship hummed with a discordant frequency, acting as a partial shield, but the closer they drew to the sun, the more the signal intensified. Jackson's voice came over the encrypted fleet channel, sounding distant and hollow, as if he was speaking from the bottom of a deep well. He reported that the crews on the larger carriers were already beginning to succumb, their operational efficiency dropping as the sailors lost the will to maintain their posts. The Reciprocity Coefficient was being tested at its most fundamental level, the ability of the human psyche to resist its own annihilation. Vance realized that they couldn't win a conventional battle here. The Sestari weren't aiming for their hulls, they were aiming for their souls. He ordered Thorn to bypass the safety limiters on the ship's internal emitters, flooded the bridge with a localized, chaotic white noise that was physically painful but served to disrupt the smoothness of the Sestari broadcast. The Omega node finally appeared on the long-range monitors, a sprawling, translucent lattice of silicate and gold that seemed to drink the light of the sun it orbited. It was beautiful in a way that felt predatory, a spiderweb of pure logic waiting to catch the heat of human passion. Surrounding it was the remnants of the integration's central guard, 200 dreadnoughts arranged in a perfect, unyielding sphere. They didn't move to intercept, they simply waited, knowing that time was on their side. Every minute the vanguard spent in the calm field was a minute closer to their total mental collapse. Vance looked at his tactical HUD, which was flickering with errors as the ship's AI also began to suffer from the neural interference. He saw the Aegis of Remembrance slowing down, its massive engines flickering as Jackson's crew struggled to keep the reactors online. The spearhead was faltering. Vance knew he had only one play left, a maneuver that the founders had hidden in the deep-level archives, a theoretical application of the reciprocity coefficient that involved the total inversion of the ship's vacuum energy core. It would turn the persistence of vision into a localized chaos well, a source of such intense, unpredictable energy that it would shatter the coherence of the Omega node's signal, but it would also likely consume the ship and everyone on it. He shared the plan with Aris and Thorn over the internal comms, his voice cracking with the effort of staying focused. There was no hesitation from either of them. They had seen the mosaic on the station. They had seen the fire in the eyes of the people on Olaris. They knew that a life lived under the calm was no life at all. Aris began the complex sequence of core reversal, her fingers moving across the interface by touch alone as her vision failed. Thorn headed to the engineering bay to manually lock the cooling vents, ensuring that the energy buildup would be directed outward rather than contained. As the persistence of vision accelerated toward the center of the integration sphere, Vance felt the calm scream in his mind, a final, desperate attempt by the Sestari to force him into submission. Images of a peaceful, quiet galaxy flashed before his eyes, a world where no one fought and no one suffered. He pushed back with everything he was, thinking of the red clay, the smell of jasmine, and the sound of a thunderstorm. He channeled his rage, his grief, and his hope into a single, defiant thought. The ship's hull began to glow with a blinding, iridescent light as the core reached the point of no return. The integration dreadnoughts finally opened fire, their graviton beams lashing out at the approaching scout, but the chaos well was already active. The beams didn't just miss, they were bent around the ship, their energy absorbed and added to the growing inferno. The persistence of vision was no longer a vessel, it was a kinetic event, a tear in the fabric of the integration's reality. Vance watched the Omega node loom larger and larger until it filled the entire viewing port. He saw the Sestari within the crystalline corridors, their tentacles flailing in a panic that their calm couldn't suppress. He reached for the final activation switch, his hand shaking, his heart hammering a frantic, rhythmic beat against his ribs. He looked at Aris one last time, seeing a smile of pure, unadulterated defiance on her face. Then he threw the switch. The world didn't end in an explosion. It ended in a roar of pure, unbridled sound that echoed through the collective consciousness of the entire system. The chaos well erupted, sending a shockwave of raw human volatility through the Omega node, shattering the crystalline lattice and silencing the calm forever. The silence that followed the destruction of the node was not the manufactured peace of the Sestari, but the heavy, expectant silence of a world that had just woken up from a long, drugged sleep. Across the system, the Vanguard crews gasped as their minds cleared, the fog of the calm lifting to reveal the stark reality of their situation. The integration dreadnoughts, their primary weapon and their source of psychological control gone, stood motionless, their crews likely experiencing the same sudden rush of unfiltered emotion. Vance's ship was a wreck. The bridge was a cavern of sparks and smoke, the viewing port shattered and held together only by the emergency force fields. But they were alive. The chaos well had expended its energy outward, leaving the core of the ship gutted but intact. Vance pulled himself up from the floor, his ears ringing and his body aching, and looked out at the remains of the Omega node. It was drifting in pieces, its golden light extinguished, its power to control the galaxy broken. He looked at his HUD and saw a message from the Aegis. Jackson was back online, his voice now clear and filled with a fierce, quiet pride. The way to Prime was open. The heart of the integration was vulnerable, and for the first time in history, the people of the core were truly alone with their own thoughts. As the Vanguard fleet began to move past the wreckage toward the capital world, Vance sat back in his chair, watching the stars. He knew that the Sestari would not surrender easily, and that High Inquisitor Vrax was still out there, likely preparing a final, desperate defense on the surface of Prime. But the momentum had shifted. The Reciprocity Coefficient had proven that the human spirit could not be dampened, only compressed, until it exploded with the force of a sun. He looked at Aris, who was already working to bypass the ship's damaged systems to get them back into the fight. They were the ones who had broken the silence, and now they were going to ensure that the galaxy never forgot the sound of a human voice. The final chapter was about to begin, and it wouldn't be written in a laboratory or a council chamber. It would be written in the streets of Prime, by the very people the integration had tried to erase. Vance felt a cold, hard resolve. They had come from the edge of the world to reclaim the center, and they wouldn't stop until every soul was free to choose its own chaos. The final descent onto the capital world of Prime was not an orbital bombardment, but a celestial rain of iron and hope. The atmosphere of the planet was thick, with the shimmering residue of the destroyed Omega node, creating a permanent, neon-violet aurora that danced over the sprawling megalopolises. Commander Kaelen Vance, standing on the charred and flickering bridge of the Persistence of Vision, watched as the Aegis of Remembrance breached the upper thermosphere. The massive human carrier did not fire its primary cannons. Instead, it deployed thousands of atmospheric entry pods, each one carrying the wild humans of the Vanguard and the archives of a forgotten Earth. The integration's planetary shields, once thought to be impenetrable, flickered and died as the viral encryption keys, perfected over centuries by the Watchers in the Calignes cluster, finally reached the central mainframe. The Sestari homeworld, the crown jewel of a thousand-species empire, lay exposed. High Inquisitor Vrax had made his final stand at the Citadel of Consensus, a spire of white stone and gravity-defying architecture that sat at the heart of the capital. It was here that the laws of the integration were written, and it was here that Vance intended to see them repealed. As the Persistence of Vision skimmed over the rooftops of the capital, Vance saw the inhabitants of Prime emerging from their dwellings. They were a tapestry of galactic life, tall, spindly avians, multi-limbed chitinates, and millions of humans whose lineages had been diluted by generations of genetic optimization. They were not running in fear. They were standing in the streets, looking up at the sky with expressions of profound, terrifying clarity. The calm was gone, and in its place was the raw, unadulterated weight of their own existence. Some were weeping, others were shouting at the sky, and many were simply standing in a daze, overwhelmed by the sudden return of their emotional autonomy. The vanguard pods landed in the plazas and parks, and as the doors hissed open, the soldiers did not emerge with guns raised. They emerged with projectors, broadcasting the images of forests, oceans, and the chaotic, beautiful history of a species that had refused to be tamed. The revolution on Prime was not fought with plasma bolts, but with the sudden, violent realization of what had been stolen from them. Vance led the breach team into the base of the citadel, his boots echoing on the polished marble floors. He was joined by Jackson, who had descended from the Aegis to witness the end of the old world. They were met with no resistance. The Sestari guards, their telepathic bonds shattered by the destruction of the node, were curled on the floor in states of catatonic shock, unable to process the influx of unfiltered sensory data from the surrounding city. The climb to the High Inquisitor's sanctum was a journey through the history of human suppression. The walls were lined with trophies of pacified cultures, shattered banners, melted crowns, and the digital remains of erased languages. Vance felt a cold, sharp anger burning in his chest, but he kept it contained, channeled into the steady rhythm of his stride. They reached the apex of the spire, a hemispherical chamber that offered a panoramic view of the burning city. In the center of the room, High Inquisitor Vrax sat in a levitating cradle of light, his many tentacles twitching in a rhythmic, agitated pattern. Vrax did not turn to face them as they entered. His voice, once a booming telepathic command, was now a thin, raspy whisper that drifted through the room like smoke. He told Vance that the humans were fools, that by destroying the calm, they had doomed the galaxy to an eternity of conflict, greed, and suffering. He spoke of the great wars that had preceded the integration, the billions who had died in the name of flags and gods. He claimed that the Sestari had been the galaxy's only hope for a lasting peace. Vance walked to the edge of the cradle and looked the Inquisitor in his large, multifaceted eyes. He told Vrax that a peace maintained by the erasure of the soul was not peace. It was a crime. He explained the final theorem of the Reciprocity Coefficient, that the value of a life was not found in its lack of suffering, but in its capacity to choose its own path, even if that path led to the dark. Humanity hadn't come to Prime to bring order. They had come to restore the right to be messy, to be violent, and to be profoundly, beautifully wrong. Jackson stepped forward and placed a small metallic sphere on the central console of the Citadel. It was the source code of the Vanguard archives, the complete, unedited record of human history, philosophy, and science. With a single command, the sphere began to pulse, uploading the data not just to the planetary network, but to the very foundation of the integration's interstellar relay system. The reciprocity was complete. The galaxy would no longer be governed by a single, central logic. It would be flooded with the chaotic, competing truths of 10,000 different cultures. The integration was dead, not because its ships were destroyed, but because its monopoly on reality had been broken. Vrax let out a low, mourning sound as he watched his empire dissolve into a sea of information. He asked Vance what the humans would do now that they were the masters of the galaxy. Vance looked out at the city, where the first fires of the New World were beginning to burn, and he smiled. He told the Inquisitor that the humans weren't going to be the masters of anything. They were going to do what they had always done. They were going to head back out into the dark, to the next frontier, to see what else was waiting to be woken up. The aftermath of the fall of Prime was a decade of chaotic reconstruction. The Vanguard did not establish a new government. Instead, they acted as a loose confederation of protectors, ensuring that no single species could ever again impose its harmony on the rest. The persistence of vision, repaired and upgraded with the finest technology of a dozen worlds, became a wandering emissary, traveling to the furthest reaches of the rim to find the last of the lost fleets and bring them into the new fold. Siobhan Aris remained at the helm, her eyes now a steady, piercing gold, a permanent mark of her union with the vacuum energy core. Thorne became the head of a galactic engineering guild dedicated to dismantling the old integration gates and replacing them with the decentralized vanguard drives. Marcus and Elara founded the Great Library on Olaris, a place where the history of every species was preserved with the same reverence as the soils of Earth. The galaxy was no longer quiet, and it was no longer harmonious, but it was alive. Kaelen Vance stood on the observation deck of his ship, looking out at a nebula that had never been mapped. He held a small glass vial in his hand, containing a few grains of red clay from the station in the Calignes cluster. He thought of the ghost of the founder and the promise of the Reciprocity Coefficient. They had given the galaxy back to itself, and in doing so, they had found their own place within it. They were no longer the wild, variable, or the human problem. They were the memory of the hearth, the reminder that no matter how far a species travels into the stars, it must always carry a piece of the home it left behind. The ship's sensors picked up a faint, rhythmic signal from a nearby star system, a new frequency, a new language, a new mystery. Vance nodded to Aris, and the persistence of vision slipped into the void, moving toward the next horizon. The door was unlocked, the fire was lit, and the long homecoming was only just beginning.